In 2018, inflation hit 2.9%. Republicans controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House. Their response? They called it a strong economy. In 2021, inflation hit 2.6%. Democrats had just taken power. Republicans called it a crisis. Same metric, same measurement, lower number, different reaction. Let's figure out why. Because what you're seeing right now isn't actually about inflation, it's about framing. And once you see how the framing works, you can't unsee it. Here's what the public is being told. Inflation under Biden has been catastrophic, worst in 40 years. Families are suffering, the economy is in ruins. And all of that is because of Democratic policies. That's the message. It's everywhere. It's consistent. And parts of it are true. Inflation did reach 9.1% in mid-2022. That's the highest rate since 9. And yes, families are absolutely feeling the pressure of higher prices. But here's what's missing from that story: the timeline. Because if you only look at inflation starting in January 2021 when Biden took office, you get one picture. But if you look at what was happening before that, you get a very different picture. Let's walk through it. In 2020, inflation was at 1.4% in January. Low, stable. Then the pandemic hit. By July 2020, inflation started climbing. It reached 1.7% by December 2020. Trump was still president. Republicans still controlled the Senate. And inflation was already accelerating. By January 2021, when Biden took office, inflation was at 1.4% again, back where it started the year before. But then it climbed to 2.6% by March, and Republicans immediately started calling it a crisis. Now, 2.6% isn't actually a crisis by historical standards. The Federal Reserve targets 2%, so 2.6 is elevated but not catastrophic. But the framing began. Biden's policies are driving inflation. By June 2021, it hit 5.4%. By November, 6.8%. And by June 2022, 9.1%. Those are real numbers, and they're high. But here's the question: what caused them? Republicans will show you a chart that starts in January 2021. And on that chart, inflation goes from 1.4 to 9.1. And they'll say, Biden did this. Look at the trajectory. Okay, let's look at that same trajectory starting in mid-2020, because inflation was already rising then. It went from 0.6% in May 2020 to 1.7% by December 2020. That's nearly a threefold increase in 7 months under Trump. But you don't see that chart in Republican messaging, because that chart complicates the narrative. Now let's talk about what actually drives inflation, because it's not just one president's policies. Inflation in 2021 and 2022 was driven by a combination of factors: supply chain disruptions from the pandemic, labor shortages, massive fiscal stimulus from both the Trump and Biden administrations, the war in Ukraine driving up energy and food prices, and the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low for too long. Some of those factors were bipartisan. The stimulus packages, both administrations supported them. The low interest rates, that started under Trump. The supply chain disruptions, global, not specific to U.S. policy. But the messaging focuses on one thing: who's in office when the number gets reported. Here's where it gets interesting. Republicans love to cite a specific statistic. Inflation is up by a certain percentage since Biden took office. You'll hear different versions. Some say 100%, some say 100%. Let's clarify what that actually means, because it's deliberately confusing. When they say inflation is up 100%, they're talking about the rate of inflation increasing. So if inflation went from 1.4% to 9.1%, that's roughly a six-fold increase in the rate. But that's not the same as prices increasing by 100%. Actual cumulative price increases from January 2021 to mid-2022 were closer to 18 to 20% depending on the category. Still significant, still painful for families, but not 100%. The confusion is intentional, because a bigger number sounds worse. Now let's compare this to how Republicans talked about inflation when they were in power. In 2008, inflation hit 5.6%. That's under George W. Bush, a Republican president. And what was the Republican response? They said it was due to global factors: energy prices, supply and demand, nothing the president could control. All true, by the way. Presidents don't directly control inflation, but apparently that's only true when it's convenient to say so. In 2018, inflation hit 2.9%. Trump was president. Republicans controlled Congress. And not only did they not call it a crisis, they actively celebrated the economy. They pointed to stock market gains and GDP growth and called it the greatest economy ever. 2.9% in 2018, great economy. 2.6% in 2021, national disaster. Same measurement, different framing. Let's talk about gas prices, because that's become the symbol of this entire debate. In 2022, gas hit over $4 per gallon in many areas, and Republicans blamed Biden. There are literally stickers at gas pumps with Biden pointing at the price saying, "I did that." But in 2008, gas hit $4.08 per gallon, national average, under Bush. And what did Republicans say then? They said the president doesn't control gas prices, that it's determined by global markets, that domestic policy has limited impact, which is correct. Presidents really don't set fuel prices. Global supply, OPEC production decisions, refinery capacity, geopolitical conflicts, those drive gas prices. But in 2008, that nuance was important. In 2022, it disappeared. Same situation, different president, different message. Here's another angle. Solutions. Republicans are campaigning on inflation. They're saying they'll fix it, and their solution is always the same: tax cuts. Specifically, corporate tax cuts and cuts for high earners. But here's the economic reality. Tax cuts increase disposable income. More income means more spending. More spending means more demand. More demand with limited supply means upward pressure on prices. That's inflation. So the solution they're proposing would actually worsen the problem they're claiming to solve. Unless, of course, the point isn't actually to solve inflation. The point is to use inflation as justification for policies they wanted anyway. Which brings us to the pattern. Because this isn't the first time. In 2010, Republicans made the deficit their central issue. The Tea Party emerged. Government spending was out of control. We were bankrupting future generations.